This is Space Minds by SpaceNews. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Kam Ghaffarian, chairman of Axiom Space, Intuitive Machines, and several other companies. We then discuss the latest news, including the troubles at Boeing. Then we wrap up with trivia.
Kam Ghaffarian, it is great to see you again. I think the last time we saw each other was about a year ago in Cape Canaveral, watching that Falcon 9 rocket take your Intuitive Machines lander up toward the moon. And I know you've got another moonshot coming up very soon, and I wanted to get to all of that. But first, let's just get into a little bit of history. And if you'll sort of allow me to paint this bit of a picture, I think this will kind of help people kind of get a sense of where you're coming from, and then you can sort of weigh in. But I want to go back to the summer of 1969. We're in Iran, the city of Isfahan. It's almost midnight, and you were watching something on your neighbor's television that would effectively change the course of your life and the trajectory of where you were heading. And I was hoping we could just start off this conversation by you kind of bringing me to that moment and tell me about that moment, how it sort of set in motion this change of events.
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, David, since I was 6 years old, I was really mesmerized with stars. You know, I remember sleeping outside because in Isfahan you could sleep outside a few months a year and just go to sleep by looking at the stars every night.
Sleep just right on the rooftops there, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And sort of think about, wow, how far they may be. Is it possible that people are living in them? And so, since that childhood, I was just sort of so intrigued and I would say mesmerized by the stars. And in 1969, again, when, like you indicated, I saw Neil Armstrong land on the surface of the moon. And, as an 11-year-old, my eyes are like this big. And It's like, holy macro, those are not my exact words. Somebody actually landed on surface of the moon, and it was like, man, that's so cool. And that's, as a child, that's what I want to do. That's what I would be involved with.
I just find that so interesting, not only in terms of that and like how many stories that I've heard about that, but in the region there, I mean, sort of early Babylonian astronomers and sort of the lack of humidity kind of gives that sort of the primacy of stargazing out there. And, I live out here in the Sonoran Desert, and I have a similar dynamic. I take my daughter out, just go stargazing. But
right.
It's interesting how like that moment was this galvanizing moment for so many different people in STEM and in space, and kind of how it had this kind of ripple effect in a way.
Exactly. I mean, I would say, I've talked to a lot of people in many conferences, and especially people who are associated with space. I would ask them, is like, raise your hand if you were inspired. And that's the key word for me, inspired, when Neil Armstrong landed on the surface of the moon. And, most of the people who are associated with NASA and space program would raise their hand. I said, that moment inspired me to be part of the space program.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just sort of wonder, like, in the context of now, where we find those sort of newfound inspirations. And I kind of want to get to all of that in terms of everything that you're doing and the sort of panoply of companies that are sort of all orienting in terms of this next phase in space. But before we do, about 2 years before the Iranian Revolution, right, it was about 1977.
January 77.
Yeah, you were in the US, you're on a student visa, Catholic University, then you worked at Lockheed. And then you just took this sort of what seems to be sort of a massive gamble right there. You're borrowing money against the value of your home to start your own engineering firm and become an advisor to NASA. And so this boy from Isfahan is all of a sudden now this advisor to NASA. And I would venture to say that gamble paid off.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, it was all in gamble. So if I was not successful with that business, I wouldn't have a home.
Yeah.
And I remember it was like $250,000. That's what it was. And we just opened this, actually we started in my basement, believe it or not. And then later on, we opened the office. And that's how I got started.
It doesn't strike me that a lot of I mean, this might just be true in business generally, but there's not a lot of part-timers in this game. You're either, I mean, Elon himself has talked about sort of, moment of truth in terms of whether to keep both Tesla and SpaceX. You yourself took out a $250,000 the take against your home. So it just doing space, it just requires kind of that level of investment and energy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're, I would say this for those of us who are space cadets, and what I mean by that is like you sort of fall in love and it's like I don't want to do anything else and
Yeah.
love what I'm doing, then you're sort of all in and you want to be committed. You don't want to do it part-time.
Well, what you're doing though is also somewhat different than some of the other sort of major players out there. I mean, when you look at Elon Musk, when you look at Jeff Bezos, when you look at Peter Beck, a lot of their interests and efforts, not interests, but a lot of their efforts are structured around getting into space, getting on orbit. And it seems that, with the companies that you've built, talk about lunar landers and commercial space stations and modular nuclear reactors and spacesuits and even sort of a research lab dedicated to sort of deciphering the physics of interstellar travel, that all of this orients around what you do once you're in space rather than getting to space. And so it almost seems like what you're looking at is the next chapter, so to speak.
Yeah, I usually tell people they're in the Uber business, in the Airbnb business. They all sort of provide the transportation
Yeah.
to get there. But once you get there, that destination, whether it's cislunar or it's the super highways to go from the Earth to the moon and Mars, or building the space station and spacesuits. Yeah, exactly right. So I'm definitely not into transportation business, at least as of now.
InnoFlight is a leader of space-integrated avionics, enabling seamless communications, networking, cybersecurity, and processing. Unrivaled quality and cutting-edge solutions push the boundaries of what is possible in space. InnoFlight, cyber-secure space avionics.
So Cam, give me a sense, a bit more of the companies, X Energy, Axiom Space. Explain to me a little bit more about what these companies are doing and sort of the challenges and opportunities you're seeing.
Sure. So let's start with Axiom Space because that's the closest to Earth, 200 feet. So we're building the first private commercial space station. We made incredible progress. We are planning to launch our first module by first quarter 2027. And I'm going to try to push it, so maybe get it done end of 2026. And it's going to connect with the current ISS. And we've spent a lot of money so far on our own building the station and the modules associated with it. So that's super exciting. But at Axiom Space, we're also are the sole provider for Artemis program, the spacesuit, the next generation spacesuit. And these are like, each one's like a spacecraft on its own. And so not only we're doing LEO spacesuit, but also lunar. So next time you see American astronauts walking on the surface of the moon, they will be wearing Axiom Space spacesuit. So it's an incredibly exciting company.
And then X Energy as well.
Yeah, so that's Axiom Space. And then you talked about Intuitive Machine, where we're building the moon landers, right? But we also are building the lunar communication satellites. We just recently won a $4.82 billion contract to develop
Saw
the
that, yeah.
and also lunar train vehicle. These are the moon buggies that traverse the surface of the moon. So that's Intuitive Machine. Quantum Space, we're really building the super highways from the Earth to the moon to Mars. And we've developed this incredible satellites called Ranger that can stay in orbit much longer and can do extraordinary things. And X Energy, we're building the safe, secure, affordable nuclear plants and the fuel for them. It's a pretty incredible company. We just closed a massive round to power the Amazon AI data centers. We're building the first plant for Dow Chemical in Cedar Reef, Texas. But we're also working on space nuclear, right? Nuclear electric propulsion and nuclear thermal propulsion. But each of these companies really are advancing state of humanity and human knowledge and propelling us forward.
Help connect the dots for me a little bit. Like, how does this web of companies that fit into these broader ambitions, like where does this coalesce? Where does this take us?
Yeah, so it's sort of interesting. One of my favorite words is synchronicity. It's sort of like you have something in the back of your head and the dots sort of get connected and you connect with the right people at the right time. So, ultimately, I really believe that the ultimate destiny for humanity is to be interstellar. And that's what I truly believe. Now, if we sort of start from that end, it's sort of like when you have a flight plan and you say, I'm going from this point to this point, and you identify a destination, and then you have intermediary steps, right, to get there. So you say, okay, if that's the ultimate destination, then we got to have something in low Earth orbit, right, to be able to, 250 miles above Earth is where the International Space Station is, to sort of, experiment with many things, which we have been doing, for a long, long time, but never commercialized. Now, what I want to do is really commercialize it. So that's where the starting point. And you say, okay, well, what's the next place? Well, the next place is the moon. I mean, that's the closest body to us, right? And to be able to live and work and have a habitat on the surface of the moon and have a regular intervals where you can go there and all of that. And then what's the one after that is Mars, right? To be able to do something similar there. But ultimately, beyond that is really going outside of other planets within our solar system, is to sort of really go beyond and say, wow, I mean, our galaxy alone is, I mean, this is the part where, I don't think people quite appreciate and understand that there are approximately 400 billion other stars just in our galaxy alone with planets around them, right? And it's 100,000 light years to go from one point of our galaxy. I mean, it's so vast, right? And just imagine the 400 billion stars, and then you leave our galaxy, and there are 2 trillion other galaxies with, all these stars in them and all that. It's just the universe is so massive, and we are so small. So I just don't think whoever was the architect, if you're not getting into spiritual aspects of this, it wasn't designed for it not to be discovered.
Well, I mean, isn't that maybe kind of part of the problem then, in terms of like the greater sort of cognition about what we're talking about, is that these numbers are so great and the distances are so vast that it's almost like the human brain can't really contextualize it, because there's nothing relative to these distances. I mean, just the notion of Alpha Centauri being 4.3 light years away, and the many thousands of years that it might take to get there by conventional means. But in that same vein, conventional means is sort of like the key word in this, right? Because it seems that you're on the vanguard of something that's happening at the same time that there's this confluence of technologies, whether it's AI or quantum or nanotechnology, and it's happening at the same time there's a push toward commercialization. And I don't know, I mean, do you see it that way? Do you see this sort of like almost this perfect storm of convergence?
Absolutely. In fact, I tell people that, we live in a golden era of space exploration because of what you just said, that there is this convergence of all of this happening. I mean, I think commercial space is accelerating things, right? And then you have these accelerators like you talked about, like AI, robotics, quantum computing, even nuclear, right? Because, like nuclear thermal propulsion is going to shorten the time that we can go to other planets, right?
But you know, that was a concept that was developed decades ago, right?
Yeah.
And it was never really brought to fruition. And there's, some crazy concepts. I mean, you sort of dig into the archives and you look at some of these documents of like these old NASA archives about the nature of exploding, nuclear fission essentially behind a craft, and how might that traverse at fractions of light speed. But I just wonder in the context that in the 1960s and the era that trickled afterwards, there were these questions of like big questions about our place in the universe, and sort of a sense of why can't we do this? And it seems to have waned and only now picking up again. And like I wonder, like, what do you attribute sort of that lull to?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think what happened was when we went to the moon, right? I mean, it created this new curiosity as like, where are we going next?
Right.
And then we said, well, hold on. We're going to come back and do other things. I mean, isn't it incredible? I mean, it was, I think, what, 50 years, 52, 53 years ago
Yeah.
that we had, Americans land on the surface of the moon, and we haven't really gone any further. So I think at that point, it created that sort of mindset, that curiosity as
Mm.
to, hey, where are we going to go next? And then, I think we stopped. And I think now, when we're talking about going to Mars and, have people land on the surface of Mars and all of that, that it is sort of bringing it back up. But I can tell you, definitely for me, it has never stopped.
Kam Ghaffarian, the boy from Isfahan who watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin make those first trots on the lunar regolith, ended up building crafts to get back there, and is looking much farther. Thanks so much for joining us.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
InnoFlight is a leader of space-integrated avionics, enabling seamless communications, networking, cybersecurity, and processing. Unrivaled quality and cutting-edge solutions push the boundaries of what is possible in space. InnoFlight, cyber-secure space avionics.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Mike, what do we've got going on this week?
This week, let's talk about one of the industry's premier space companies, and that is Boeing. Boeing's been in the news a lot the last year. And the reason we're going to talk about them today is because there's a group called Space Capital. They are an investment firm, and they publish a list of investment trends each year. And for 2025, one of their predictions has gotten a lot of folks talking. And that prediction is that Boeing will divest their space division this year. Obviously,
Which is crazy, right? I mean, that's a crazy concept.
Right. It's not it's not a completely out there suggestion. The Wall Street Journal reported in August that Boeing was in the early stages of that discussion. And obviously, Boeing is part of United Launch Alliance. There have been a lot of rumors that United Launch Alliance is for sale. So those rumors have been out there for a while. But it's just interesting to think of, hey, there's going to be a space industry, and Boeing might not be a part of it.
I guess it's not crazy in the context of you've been paying attention to recent trends, but it's crazy in the context of like Boeing as a sort of a legacy company that had to do with space from like almost its inception. I mean, we're talking, this is a company that partnered with Northrop Grumman to develop the lunar module in the Apollo era. They worked on the space shuttle. They worked on the space station. They worked on the X-37B, that space plane for the Space Force. They've developed, the space launch system, at least part of it, for NASA's sort of deep space exploration goals. They've got satellites. So it's like you think of Boeing, you think of, legacy in space in a way. So like them leaving, or at least divesting some of their interest there, it's a remarkable type of just thought process in of itself.
Right. And in this report, the Space Capital Group, they said, hey, part of this is influenced by Elon Musk having a prominent position in the Trump administration, and they expect this strong pro-growth, anti-regulation movement to kind of
Yeah.
take hold in the space industry. And we talked a little bit about this last week, that we expect to see this new group of entrants into the space industry. I think a lot of legacy folks have said, hey, there are maybe ways that the government might do business differently, and those can help us as well as help some of these Silicon Valley startups that might want to get into space. But I don't know if folks have kind of really thought through or really processed, geez, it's kind of weird to not think of Boeing as a space company anymore,
And and this is
or
just
potentially.
right. This is just a major. It's also a major revenue driver, at least has been for years. I mean, Boeing's defense and space and security division alone is a multi-billion-dollar division. So, it's interesting in the context of all this new emphasis on commercial space, all this new emphasis on defense relative to sort of emerging geopolitical rivalries, and the very question or concept of Boeing moving away from that.
Yeah, and as we're talking, the Boeing recently announced their fourth quarter earnings. Year over year figures not what they were hoping for when it comes to revenue, 31% drop. So,
Yeah.
we've seen that they have a new CEO, and I think this is the kind of they're looking for answers right now.
Yeah. All right. The next story that we're going to talk about came to us from the incomparable Jeff Faust, SpaceNews,
Yep.
who found. I mean, I'll let you take it away in terms of what he found.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this idea of advertising in space that can be seen without a telescope. And he attended um, a recent meeting where of some of the nation's best astronomers. They put out a statement saying, "Hey, we don't want this to happen. We're nervous about this. This is already, this kind of advertising is already banned in the United States and has been for decades. But this idea that it's resurfacing again it's an interesting one, and it it kind of cuts to, what is your view of space? Is it this final frontier that's wide and open and you know to me just very, very spacious, not to use that word? And then the second part is, or is it more like, is it crowded? You're constantly trying to get out of the way of satellites? Is it, Times Square? And it gets at these competing visions of
Times
space.
Square in space sounds just about like the most horrible thing I could think of.
Right.
I don't
But
know that I can maintain sort of an objectivity on this issue here. I mean, just like the notion, I was telling you this earlier, like I take my daughter camping quite a bit. And
right.
the idea behind that is to be able to see the stars outside the light pollution of major cities. And the notion that we're sitting over like s'mores looking up at a billboard from, pick your favorite Fortune 500 company I mean, it's remarkable, if abhorrent, but
Yeah.
that's my 2 cents at least.
Yeah, and I think people will have very, very strong feelings on this, but it's not coming out of nowhere. It's
No.
the some of the astronomers are concerned about actions that Russia has taken, that particularly they might be interested in this sort of thing. There's been talk of this in the past, and so it's not it is it's not coming out of not coming out of nowhere. This is it's founded in activity.
You mentioned Russia. I did a little bit of digging here, and I just found that back in 1996, Pepsi reportedly, this is according to BBC and a few other news outlets, paid Russia's sort of struggling space program at the time to float well, they're still struggling, but to float a sort of a replica of a giant soda can outside the Mir space station. So, like, there is, commercial, like to your point, advertising in space is not a entirely new trend. I mean, SpaceX back in 2018 sent a Tesla Roadster into orbit as sort of that initial payload for the Falcon Heavy. And then, even the Intuitive Machines launch that we saw back in February of last year, there was, the Columbia Sportswear logo emblazoned across the side of the craft. The difference, I think, is that you could see none of that with the naked eye.
Yeah.
This would be different.
Yeah, and it's just again, it's I think people will have a very guttural response to that, and
Yeah.
really it speaks to how you envision the future of space, I think.
Well, I think that that's a perfect corollary to our next topic of conversation in terms of like staring out at the cosmos. And this concept that the James Webb Space
Yeah,
Telescope, could be facing some cuts.
right. And the group that runs the James Webb Space Telescope, they recently said, hey, they're looking at a budget cut of potentially 20% to operations. That would mean just a whole lot fewer of missions. And
Yeah.
right now there is a huge backlog from scientists wanting to use the telescope. I think it's about 9 to 1, meaning there's 9 requests for every hour that they can accommodate. And it's just been one of those, as you said, kind of touchstones to the modern space program. Whereas,
Yeah.
for years, I think a lot of people related very directly to rockets and the shuttle program. I think, there's probably a generation of people that space exploration looks a little bit differently. And I think the James Webb Space Telescope is part of that.
I mean, I think that's the most interesting thing about all this, because when we talk about James Webb, I think there's really a two-pronged side of this one. There's the science side, and you talk about like the Webb deep field, which is the deepest infrared image of the universe ever captured, and you can talk about the study of distant exoplanets in a way that we've never really been able to see prior to the James Webb, and the concept of what planets are in those habitable zones. And you see those beautiful images of those star forming regions and the concepts of those supermassive black holes. But there's this cultural and almost philosophical quality to this too. And I'm just thinking about anecdotally, my father, who's not a huge space guy, will
Yeah.
routinely tell me about a James Webb image that he saw. And so like the downstream effects of this, I think, are just so pronounced. And I would even liken it to what we saw in sort of the wake of the Apollo program, and how many people were just sort of captivated by this, and
Yeah.
the ripple effect that had, and you see that with James Webb. And so I guess in this modern context, this question, yes, commercial investment, yes, defense spending investment, the science, that's a question mark.
Yep. And I think it will be. I think that's a conversation we're going to be having for a long time.
Yeah.
Space Loop. Let's close the loop with trivia and audience perspective on this week's space news.
All right, let's move on to trivia. So last week, we were talking about the swabbing of the exterior of the International Space Station for microbial life and why they were doing it. And so, there's a big shout out to Eric Gribble, who we're very proud of you. You got it. You nailed it on the head. You emailed us. And it has to do with the answer was C. And it was microorganisms surviving and reproducing in sort of the harsh space environment, and how radiation intersects with that. And so, all kinds of questions how that might affect in terms of the pharmaceutical market and everything else. So, a lot of interesting things that are happening, both the ISS and the promise of some of these commercial stations. But that's the answer. Eric, well done. I want to move on to today's trivia question, which you can check on our social channels, or you can just sort of wait for the next podcast. Question is this: which nearby dwarf galaxy, located some 160,000 light years away, contains the Tarantula Nebula, which is the largest and most productive star-forming region in the local universe? So, is it A, the Andromeda; B, the Large Magellanic Cloud; C, Sagittarius Dwarf Galaxy; or D, Whirlpool Galaxy? You know that
All
one, Mike?
right. I do not. I do not. I have a guess, but I'm not sure. Um, I wanted to raise one other point, which is last week you talked to Sir Peter Beck. We got a question from one of our listeners who said, which company is going to be the DHL and FedEx of Leo, of Lunar, of Mars? Rocket Lab sure sounds likely to do this, but they wanted to know what's our take on the situation, and we also want to know what's your take on the situation. You can write us at spaceminds@spacenews.com. But David, what do you think there?
Well, I got my crystal ball right here. I'm just sort of like checking it here. I'm not sure. I mean, you look at a lot of companies. SpaceX seems to be in the driver's seat, not only by virtue of the launch cadence that they've already had, but their influence in the White House. Jeff Bezos at Blue Origin, New Glenn, that can't be discounted. Peter Beck, our last interview, clearly they're doing some really interesting things. So there's a host of players. You can't count out what China is doing. You can't count out what ESA is doing. The Indian space sector is picking up. I mean, there's just so many more players now, and yet if we're talking about service providers, that's just a question you wouldn't have gotten, I don't think, as frequently back during the 1960s and the Apollo era, when this is so new. And now we're talking about the real, the underpinnings of an orbital market that's just much more pronounced than it was even 5 years ago. So it's just emblematic of where we're at now.
Right. And if we're talking about the mundane, that maybe that is interesting. Maybe that means that the industry has advanced to a really significant point. I'm struck by the two companies that they mentioned there, DHL and FedEx, both because they're cargo companies, I guess. And you don't yes, I understand the point of going to Leo or Lunar or Mars, but you can also think of them as transporting cargo, and that's a theme this week at a space conference in Orlando. That's something that the Air Force has looked at, and how do you use rockets to transport cargo? And I think it's a really interesting topic, but that also shows, hey, this can only happen with an increased cadence, and we've seen a lot of that the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, cargo equals infrastructure equals telecoms equals, who knows, settlements at some point. So I mean, that's clearly what's being discussed and what's being planned, both with Artemis and some of these Chinese plans. So brave new world, Mike.
Yeah, it is. Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Again, we want to hear your answers to this question. Write us at spaceminds@spacenews.com. And I'm Mike Gruss.
I'm David Ariosto. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.